In this lecture, we're going to go ahead and create some more advanced texture for a wooden crate. Now, before we move forward with this, let's go ahead and save this out so we don't lose it. So we'll come to Save As. And I'm just going to save it out as wooden crate. Next, I'm going to go ahead and take all of my wooden crate layers that have texture on them, and I'm going to put them into their own folder. Then I'm going to turn that folder off and drag it to the bottom. That way, we don't have to worry about that right now while we're creating our second texture. Next, let's go ahead and jump back into our document that has our two pieces of wood on it, and we're going to save these out also. So we'll come up to File, Save As, and I'm going to call this Wood Texture. And then I'm going to add the number 1 at the end because we're going to create a second wooden texture. So let's hit Enter, save that, hit OK. Perfect. Now we can go ahead and select both these and delete them. Now, last time we kind of had the problem that our pieces of wood weren't long enough to stretch the span of our X pattern. So we want to make sure this time we create a little bit skinnier pieces of wood. So maybe something like that. And what we're going to do is we're going to fill this in with sort of a grayish orange color. So we're going to come down to our oranges, somewhere about there should be good. And we want to come in somewhere around here. Hit OK. And let's go ahead and fill that in. Now, this is our base color. From here, we're going to build on top of this, starting with the darker highlights and moving up all the way to the brightest highlight. So now I'm going to go ahead and select a more orange color. And I'm going to bring up the lightness a little bit to about there, maybe a little bit more towards the saturated side, and hit OK. Now what we want to do is we want to start painting out the basic shapes and forms that are going to be in our wood grain. Now last time it was a lot more simple to paint in the wood grain because all we had to do was draw the lines and then create a highlight side to that and then just turn down the opacity on those. This time it's going to be more complicated and you're going to have a little bit more understanding about light and shadow. So if you're having a hard time with this part of the course, go ahead and go back to the basics of drawing and values, and that's going to help you a lot with this section of the course. So let's go ahead and start painting in those base shapes for the form of our wood grain. Now again, go ahead and do a Google search for wood grain if you're having a hard time remembering what wood grain looks like. Last time you were just looking for the pattern. This time you actually want to look for the form of wood grain. Now you don't have to make your wood grain look exactly the way it looks in real life. You can go ahead and use a little bit of your imagination, but for the most part you want it to be based off of real life wood grain. Everything that looks really nice and good in the art world usually is based off of the real world. So you can see here, I'm just creating really simple shapes for my wood grain, like so. Awesome. Next, we're going to go ahead and create a mid-ground color between these two colors. And we're going to do that by bringing our brush size down to 5% by hitting the number 5 on our keyboard. And now we can go ahead and paint on that edge like so. And then you'll see if we zoom in there, you can see we get this color that's in between those two colors. Let's go ahead and select that with our eyedropper, then switching back over to our brush tool and bringing our brush opacity back up to 100%. That's going to allow us to paint with that color, but without it being transparent, like so. We can also bring down our brush size. Now I want to switch my brush over to more of a paintbrush. Right now I'm on this hard edged brush. I want to switch over to this guy right here, and that's just going to allow me to get more organic and wispy type of brush strokes. So now we're just going to kind of randomly paint the edges of these in just to blend it in a little bit more. Now this is definitely a process, the way we're going to be painting this texture, and it can take a while, but just know that things that look really good usually take a good amount of time to create. Perfect. All right, so now we're kind of getting to our basic setup. Next, what we want to do is we want to add some more texture in there. So I'm going to go ahead and select this lighter color, and then I'm going to find an even lighter version of that. So somewhere about there, and maybe more towards the orange side. Somewhere about there should be good. Then using my brush tool, I can go ahead and start painting in more texture. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of create a pattern texture that kind of looks like football shapes or eye shapes. They're kind of like ellipses, but the edges of them are pinched. So if you ever look at wood that's been carved, you'll see the same pattern in it. Now this is a little bit too light for me, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring down my brush opacity to 30% by hitting the number 3 on my keyboard, and now I can go ahead and paint, and it's a lot lighter. And if I want it to be darker, I can go ahead and paint on top of that again and just keep layering that on. The whole process of this type of painting is all about layering. We're just going to keep layering and layering and layering until we get the look that we want. Now in this case, honestly, I'm not really following any rules about where the light source is coming from. It's kind of coming from everywhere all around it, because once we add this to our crate drawing, we're going to be flipping these back and forth, up and down. And so if they have a light source, it's going to make it look incorrect when we flip it upside down. So I'm trying to keep it very neutral in the way that the light is hitting it. So you'll see down here, there's highlight on that side. And then we're also going to add highlight on this other side too. So just try to keep it as neutral as possible. Great. So now we have our first layer of real highlight, I guess you could say. And next what we're going to do is we're going to add a little bit more color into that. So we're going to come over to our color picker and we're going to grab a pretty saturated brown, and we want it to be on the darker side, so somewhere around there. Hit OK. And now we're going to start adding some of that into these cracks and crevices. This is just to make it look a little bit more interesting. Sometimes you might find that when you start adding colors and different hues and saturations to your artwork, it doesn't really work out, and that's okay. All you have to do is undo it. Honestly, we should probably be doing this on a separate layer, but I'm not really worried about it right now. But if you're worried about something not looking good, do it on a separate layer, and then you can always just delete that layer. Great. Now I'm going to go ahead and find an even lighter highlight color. So I'll select this color down here, and then I'm going to come up to about there, should be good. Come up more towards the yellows. And using my brush tool, I'll go ahead and start painting in even brighter highlights. Now I'm going to bring my brush opacity down to 20% now by hitting the number 2 on my keyboard, because at this point I want it to be pretty sensitive as to how much highlight it's adding to my artwork. Great. Next, what I want to do is I want to brighten this a little bit. It's looking a little bit too dark for me, and it's not looking enough like wood. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this mid color right there. And using my brush tool, I'm just going to start filling in large areas with that color. Like I said, this is all a process, and you just have to work back and forth, and find what works for you and what you like. Then I'm going to grab another highlight color, but an even lighter one. I'm going to start filling in more areas, like so. Great. Now let's go ahead and add a little bit more highlights to this. So I'm going to select my brightest highlight color, and then I'm going to bring it up even more, and I'm going to come way more towards the yellows and saturate that a little bit more also. I'm going to go ahead and start painting in new highlights. Now, if you're feeling a little bit confused about what's going on here, just remember that when you're creating artwork like this, you're just building up on the highlights. So you generally start with shadow, and then you add a little bit lighter of a highlight on top of that, and then a lighter highlight and a lighter highlight, and you keep building and building. And then sometimes you have to change things like I did when I grabbed my mid color and I painted on top of some of the stuff so I can neutralize it all out and start from the beginning. But basically that's what you're going to be doing, is building up highlights. And also make a note that when you have a highlight that slowly blends into a darker color, and it's going to give it sort of a look as though your surface is doing this. If we're looking at your surface from the side, it's going to look like it's doing something like that if you have a nice soft blend into it. So such as this area right there, it's kind of looking like it's doing that. If you have a really hard edge like this, it's going to look like it's doing this. So just keep that in mind while you're creating your artwork. You'll notice that I'm using my eyedropper tool to select mid colors, which are the colors that are being mixed between two colors. And I'll select those colors and then I'll start painting with that to help blend two colors together. And then I'm just gonna try some blue in there, add a little bit of blue-gray, just to see how that looks. And it turns out that I like it pretty well. So remember to just experiment with things, experiment with colors, the values of things, just do a lot of experimenting. Alright, that brings us to the end of this lecture. So in this lecture, we got the basic paint setup for our wood texture. In the next lecture, we're going to go ahead and take this wood plank and paint it a little bit more to look a little bit better. And then we're going to make a copy of it, move it over, and sort of reshape the painting landscape on it to make it look like a different piece of wood. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lecture. Alright, let's go ahead and finish up this wood plank. So the first thing I want to do is I want to select the shape of my plank of wood. That way I don't paint outside of it. Next, I'm going to go ahead and select one of these lighter colors. And what I want to do is I want to find an even lighter version of that, because right now my plank of wood is looking a little bit too dark. So about there should be good. And I'll use my brush tool, and putting my brush at 2% or 20% opacity, I'm going to go ahead and paint in some of these areas so they're not so dark. Great. Next, let's go ahead and find a really bright highlight color. So I'm going to come straight up like so, and maybe a little bit more down towards the red side. Hit OK. Now let's go ahead and start painting in some highlight. Next, let's grab an even brighter highlight. So I'll come up to about there, and I'm going to come back more towards the yellows. It's getting a little bit too cool for me. Let's go ahead and paint in those highlights. Now I'm going to go ahead and grab sort of a cool color, a blue color. So I'm going to come up into my blues and bring it somewhere around here. Hit OK. And now I'm going to go ahead and just start adding a little bit of blue into my wood. This just makes it look a little bit more interesting. Great. Now the last thing I want to do is I want to add a little bit more of a darker edge around the edge of my plank so we have more shadow and we'll be able to differentiate between the two planks of wood when they're next to each other. And I also want to add a little bit of dark shadow into these cracks to give it a little bit more depth. So I'm going to select this outside color And then I'm going to find a darker version of it. So I'm going to come down to about there. And then I'm going to go ahead and start painting in that darker edge. Now I still have my brush set to 20% opacity. You'll see how I'm painting into these cracks to give it more depth. And remember, you're at 20% opacity, so you might have to go over the edges a couple of times. The reason why we're at 20% opacity, even though we're trying to get a completely dark edge, is just because we don't want the edges to look too sharp. And we want it to keep it pretty organic. And so we're keeping it at 20% because that allows us to build up the different transparencies on top of each other. Great. Now one last thing I want to change is right here, we're not having very much definition, and these two sort of shapes are just kind of morphing together down here. So I'm going to go ahead and select this darker color, and I'm going to give some definition to that, kind of break it up. Just like so. Now I'm also thinking I want a little bit more highlight also, so I'm going to go ahead and select my highlight color and find just a little bit lighter version of that, somewhere up there. And now I'm just going to add the last little bits of highlight. And I promise this will be the last thing we do on this. Cool, so you just made your first hand-painted plank. Let's go ahead and make a copy of this layer. So Control J or Command J. And then we're going to drag that over like so. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my transform tool, and then I'm going to right click, and I'm going to come down to flip horizontal, and then I'm going to right click again and hit flip vertical. That way we kind of get an opposite shape to start off with when we start creating our second plank. Let's go ahead and hit enter. So what we want to do here is we want to completely reshape the landscape of this plank. And we're going to use these colors that are already here as a base, because that'll make it much quicker and easier. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to take my mid color, and I'm going to bring my brush opacity up to 4%. And then we're just going to start sort of repainting in the shape of our wood. So this time I want to keep my wood pretty straight. This one is kind of going diagonal, and we want this wood grain to be going more in a straight direction. That way we're kind of changing up the visuals of our wood, and they don't both look exactly the same. Alright, next what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and grab one of these inner dark colors, so like that right there. And now we can go ahead and start painting in sort of the shadow in between each grain of our wood. I'm going to select a darker color, so maybe like this color down here. Start painting with that. And this time we might add sort of a little knot here. For now, I'm just going to kind of create a little cavern right there for it. Great. Now let's go ahead and grab another dark color, so maybe something like right there. And start painting with that. And we're still kind of painting with too much of a blue, so I want to try to get in there and get a dark brown. Next, let's go ahead and start painting in our highlights. So I'm going to select one of my darker highlight colors, so maybe from like right there. And now let's start painting those highlights in. So I'm just going to start off by painting right along the edges of some of my wood grain. And over here, I'm going to add a little bit more of a light area because I want to add a sort of another shape over here, like so. Same with down here. Cool. Now let's go ahead and select this brown color over here, and let's just add a little bit more color into this. Now I'm going to select this darker shadow color over here on my other piece of wood, and I'm going to paint in a little bit more shadow within this cavernous little area where we're going to add a knot. We might add a little bit more shadow over here also. Perfect. Now let's go ahead and grab our really bright highlight color, and let's start adding some real highlights in here. Cool. Now I'm going to go ahead and select this darker shadow color over here. I'm just going to start painting in some of these areas that I no longer really want. So I might add a little bit more shadow right here. And remember, you can always use your eyedropper tool to select that mid color so you can blend. You might add a little bit more blending in here just to soften things up. Now let's go ahead and paint in that knot. So I'm going to reselect this highlight color down here, and my knot is going to come around like so, and then it's going to make a little swirl within our little cavern. Like so. I'm I'm gonna add a little bit more shadow on this side, so I'm gonna select this darker color here, start painting around there like so. Perfect. Now let's go ahead and select our final highlight color. So I'm gonna grab my highlight color again, and then grab just a little bit brighter version of that. And now we're gonna add the last little highlights on our wood. Okay, I think this looks pretty good. I'm just noticing that there's not much definition between our wood grains, so what I want to do is I'm going to grab my dark color again, and then I'm going to go ahead and just paint a little bit more definition in there. And then down here, I'm going to go ahead and select this color. I'm just going to sort of fill this in a little bit more because that shape looks a little bit weird to me and unnatural. And one little highlight down here. Maybe grab a lighter highlight color. Great. We're now done creating the hand-painted texture for our wooden crate. In the next lecture, we're going to go ahead and take this and apply it to our drawing. Remember that when you're doing hand-painted artwork, the idea is to start with your darkest color and move up to your brightest highlight. And then if you need to go back, you can change things and add other colors in, but for the most part, that's the way you want to do it. Thanks for watching this lecture, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.